Home fruit culture in Louisiana is one of my most popular topics to visit about, both with me and with general interest in the public. This is an abbreviated talk that I give for Master Gardener education, and we'll just jump into it so I can hopefully cover everything that I would like to cover in this time. So, the first thing, let's talk about getting an orchard started from scratch. So, your ideal orchard site preferably would have full sun. There are some exceptions in Louisiana where you're not going to want to necessarily want completely full sun for all commodities like raspberries or strawberries in the middle of the summer. Ideally, a silty loam soil, but not much you can do about that if you don't have it, and there's ways around that as well. Now, in Louisiana, a slight slope is mainly advantageous for water drainage, but there are a few places in the northern part of the state, or if you live close to a levee, where it would be very useful to keep that in mind for airflow as well. And then irrigation source. Now, sunlight. So, for most things, you want as much sunlight as possible for the energy effect, but not necessarily the heat effect. And the reason we want sunlight is that's the source of the energy for a plant to convert light into sugars and dry matter through photosynthesis. And you will see this all the way across through plant health, where fruiting plants will be much more productive and vigorous in a full sun environment as opposed to a shady environment. The most often case I see this would be a comparison of citrus, because citrus are very long lived, and sometimes they get planted in an area where they eventually get shaded out and they lose some of their vigor. Regular pruning is also an important component to maintaining good sunlight penetration, because fruit trees can end up shading themselves out through their overvigorous growth if we're not careful. So you want to prune to maintain good productive limbs too. Now, soil, I mentioned there's not much you can do if you have a poor soil to start with. But as a homeowner level, you can grow across many soil types, as opposed to a commercial grower might want to avoid a heavy clay soil for some commodities because it would reduce their inputs. But as a homeowner, you're not necessarily trying to maximize economic inputs, and you can grow in a heavier soil or even a very much more sandy soil. And like I said, very little can be done to improve a soil type, but you can incorporate organic matter and other soil amendments on a small scale to make some correction. But if you have a large piece of property, there's just not much you can do about that. And if that's the case, you can build a structure and kind of have a little isolated area that has ideal soil type, just to kind of get it going before it goes in the native soil type. But there's different thoughts about that as well. Sometimes it's better just to shock the tree and get it used to a heavy or light soil type, and then just manage it other ways. Now, soil test and fertilization. Your soil test for an orchard for tree crops should be done well in advance of planting. And the reason for this is you're going to want to, especially if you are a commercial orchard, you would want to add amendments months in advance so that it kind of has the ability to percolate through the soil and get where you want it to be. A homeowner, we have a little bit more flexibility, but really the main takeaway from this slide is do not fertilize in the hole when you're potting a fruit tree. You should know if you're buying a fruit tree, you've already spent a significant investment. They're way more expensive than a lot of other landscape plants, in part because there's more labor through grafting and other cultivar selection in that. And if that's the case, you want to make certain, sometimes they have sensitive roots and you don't want to burn them through contact with fertilizer. And the reason that works is there's a lot of science to it, but the simplified version is that fertilizers act as a salt and it can take water out the roots and burn it. Now, pH is important for most of you. You're going to want to aim about 6.0 to 6.5. A little bit above that, you're going to want to correct with lime, and correct with sulfur. Pardon me. And below that, you will want to correct with lime. Blueberries are an exception to that, where you're going to want an acidic soil, and that can be difficult for some of us on a more alkaline soil, like kind of close to the Red River, and you may need to grow it in a pot. Now, a lot of it depends on what side of the Red River, but if that's something you want more information about, please contact your local extension agent and we can help walk you through that. Now, slope, like I said, for us, the main reason for slope is good water drainage. You do not want your fruit trees to have wet feet for extended periods because that will hinder root development, cause a weak root system, and cause it not to be as fruitful. But air drainage can be critical in some of the little bit more northern areas of the state or close to levees where it can create pockets, and that's something you're going to want to watch. But for most of you, it's not going to be a critical thing. Now, planting. So this holds true for almost all things you're going to plant. You want to minimize your airspace left by digging the hole, because when you're digging that hole, it's extreme aeration of the soil and you're leaving huge air pockets. Now, roots left in contact with large air pockets can dry out and potentially die in a severe situation. And that's why you should always water in right after planting to help minimize that. It'll help compress some of those air pockets and also give it a nice, good, excuse me, my phone was going off, a nice, good watering in to help it recover from any stress it may have from being potted. Now, here's another thing. If you're planting a fruit tree, almost always, unless it's something like an olive that's propagated from rooting cuttings, but like citrus in particular, it's going to be grafted. Look at where your graft line is, and that's a good thing for general orchard management and health to start with. You want to find out where your graft is on your apples, pears, citrus, and the first time you're going to use that is when you're planting, to make certain that you're not planting it below the soil line, because if you do, you kind of defeat the purpose of the grafting. And you want to maintain that graft union well above where you're planting, and it also helps you watch where rootstocks may be. Mulching also helps retain moisture. I recommend it for most orchard situations, and helps reduce your watering you need, and in some cases can even reduce disease pressure. So irrigation, water is very important to plants, and it's used for several things. One is it's used for moving nutrients in their vascular system, and then it is an important component of photosynthesis, which translates into making the fruit and sugars. So you really need to ask yourself before you go too wild planting an orchard is, do I have the ability to irrigate it? So why is it important? Fruit is essentially water and a fancy, tasty package. So depending on what you're growing, it can be anywhere from 70 to 95% water. If a fruit tree is stressed and not getting the water that it wants, it will abort fruit. So you may find that it set a lot of fruit, then you had a dry spell, and then you lost a lot of fruit. That could have contributed to it. And another thing I like to tell people, if you have a large orchard, a 5-gallon bucket is not a good water source unless you just want to put an extensive amount of sweat equity into it. It's better if you have a hose or some other long-term solution where you can water easily, and it's not a chore, because if it's a chore of having to fill in buckets and carry that around, you're going to water less often. So just want to touch on some general pruning and tree training and fruit thinning for some tree orchard commodities, because it's very important to maintaining the health and also contributes towards disease resistance if you do it properly. So your general pruning rules is you want to prune back 1/3 of your new growth from the growing season, not 1/3 of the overall growth. Now there's times when there's an exception to that, because you want to prune to completely remove dead, damaged, and diseased limbs. You also want to remove limbs that are going inward towards the center of the tree. And also remove suckers, because this is taking away valuable carbohydrates from the fruit production, and you'd be surprised it doesn't take long for a sucker to overwhelm a grafted tree. Now, for training fruit trees, there's 2 general forms of tree training in Louisiana. Central leader is normally used for apples and pears. Essentially, you're just training strong limb architecture for something that's going to want to grow tall. And then open center is very important for things that are more prone to disease, like peaches. And what it does is it creates like an open vase where airflow can come through, sunlight can come through, and it greatly reduces the disease pressure. So your central leader technique is pretty much training for long-term health of a tree, removing crisscrossing branches and kind of just supporting strong branch angles. but you want a strong branch angle because hopefully it'll be full of fruit. So that means you want more of a 90-degree, almost coming straight out branch as opposed to a short branch angle, which would be 45 degrees or so, which will be much weaker. And this is a top view. I like this because it gives you an idea of how extensive this tree training needs to be. You really are wanting to remove overlapping limbs because if one limb covers another higher up, it reduces the photosynthesis of the one below it, and you can kind of just create a situation where limbs are not productive. And it's really something that should be maintained every year. Now, how do you train limbs? It's best to start small and use some mechanical aids. Clothespins work really well for small trees, but once the tree gets a little bit larger, you may need to get creative and create some type of weights that help pull it down a little bit more. And in some cases, you can just continuously prune until one comes away like you want it to, but more than likely, you're going to have to use some clothespins or something to get it started. And this is what your final product should look like. Much different than what a old abandoned tree on a homestead may look like. Now, an old tree on a homestead may still be very productive and very fruitful, but it won't be making the most out of its inputs as opposed to one that's been trained correctly. Now, the open center technique, mentioned it casually, it's more of an open vase, and that's very important for things that are prone to fungal diseases because it essentially reduces the humidity trapped in the center of the tree and allows more sunlight to go through. You have that better air circulation, that better sunlight penetration. It reduces the ability of fungi to get started on the leaves and the fruit. And it takes a little bit more intense management strategy to maintain this. And the hardest part is going from A to B for most people. You're going to go and you're going to buy this beautiful fruit tree, and it's going to hurt most people's hearts to go ahead and cut off that much of it. But it is something you should consider for best disease management practices. That doesn't mean if you don't, you won't get fruit off of it, but you will likely shorten the life of the tree and you won't get as much fruit. And just more, you're mainly creating 3 to 4 main scaffolding limbs, and the height you want to do it will differ for everybody because you ideally want to be able to get her under here and cut grass. So you may not want it too low to the ground. You may want to encourage it a little bit higher, depending on what your management strategy is going to be. And top view is going to be very similar. It doesn't have to be 4. I see a lot of them where it's 3 equally spaced, but 4 gives you kind of some flexibility should something go wrong. And this is what your finished product would look like during the dormant season, and this is what it would look like in actively growing. You see a lot of these inner limbs have been pruned back quite vigorously over time to encourage that airflow through there and that sunlight penetration. Fruit thinning is very important and one of the most, next to tree training, underutilized thing in home orchards. Not all commodities need to be fruit thin, but most of your tree fruit need to. You want to distribute the weight because they will overbear. And if you leave this much fruit on there, you're going to be very disappointed when you pick it. It's not going to be near as sweet as it could be if you thinned it. And sometimes you exasperate nutrient deficiencies. The most common one I've seen is in peaches, where there's such a heavy calcium demand at this point that the pit in the center becomes brittle. And you know at that point that, okay, it really wasn't thinned quite enough. So kind of some before and after pictures. You just about want to leave 5 to 6 inches between each fruit, because in general it takes about 10 to 15 leaves to well fill one tree fruit crop, either it be an apple or a peach. So you want to help that balance be more in favor of the leaves so that you get sweeter, better developed fruit. Another thing to consider is chilling requirements. Now, most things that enter a dormancy period require some period between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. If you don't get enough chilling hours, they won't leave dormancy and they will be hampered in their coming out. And if you get too many, so if you plant something that's really better suited for South Louisiana and North Louisiana, and it accumulates too many chilling hours too quickly, it'll leave dormancy early and be damaged by a late frost. So the range of chilling hours we have in Louisiana is really large, from 150 in the coastal regions to about 1,000 in the northern parts. Most of us in the central part of the state can range between 6 to 800. And this is a visual example of what happens when you do not get enough chilling hours. So what has happened in this tree did not leave dormancy because it didn't get the number of hours in that temperature range. And for it to leave dormancy, it'll have to get hours above 80 a lot of times. And it'll come out late in the season, too late that it won't set fruit. It'll be a weak tree, and often it can be the start of an ultimate decline in our orchard, a multi-year decline based off of it not getting a carbohydrate reserve. So this is a chilling hours map to get an idea of where you may be and what you might want to consider. It's interesting, on some large cities you see that cities are heat traps and that they have little localized pockets of less chilling hour requirements. If you need more help understanding chilling hours or finding out what fruit crops might be best for you, feel free to contact us after the seminar. Now, things to consider when you're planting is, for most of us, we're going to be on the low end of the chilling hour scale. So you're going to want to look at figs, berries, grapes, and a lot of stuff like this. Now, this is a very good time to mention citrus does not have a chilling hour requirement because it really does not enter a it's like a pseudo dormancy. It doesn't like that winter weather, and it's just the metabolism slows down, but it's not a true dormancy, which is why so many of us have damaged citrus trees right now because of this cold spell. It was not in dormancy like an apple or a pear would have been, so it bared the brunt of that chilling injury. So what happens when it enters that dormancy, it's resistant to cold temperatures, and it can get below freezing and be fine. But things that don't enter dormancy get burned real bad. Pollination requirements are something to consider. A lot of things are self-fruitful, but you still get better quality fruit if you have two different cultivars that will pollinate one another. That genetic diversity, the plant can sense that and will invest sometimes more energy into it because it increases its odds of having a successful next generation. There are some plant commodities, though, where you will need a pollinator plant. And here's some ones that require cross-pollination, like your apples, pears, plums, blueberries, kiwi, and muscadines, as opposed to ones that are self-fruitful: peaches, strawberries, bunch grapes, blackberries, citrus, pomegranate, persimmons. And like I mentioned, strawberries is the one I noticed it the most. When I had just a handful of strawberries and they were isolated, they weren't getting the best pollination. As soon as I upped the number of strawberry cultivars I had in plants, more cross-pollination was going and I was having better well-filled fruit. Now that can be for several reasons. It may not be due to the two species cultivars crossing. It may be that I was attracting better pollinators. But a lot of things go into that. So poor pollination is probably one of the leading causes of misshapen fruit outside of insect damage. So you can see how this kind of misshapen strawberry creates little uneven fruit development, as opposed to this pest damaged one where around where it was attacked is just a kind of a localized extreme part there. Now there are some cases where this can be poor pollination as well, but in general you're going to get your kind of odd-shaped fruit that looks fine, other than it being odd-shaped, is going to be a result of poor pollination. Disease resistance, other than heat tolerance, is the number one thing we're going to want to consider when planting something. And you're going to want to consider this when you decide what to plant. If you're planting peaches, disease resistance is key. You need to get a well-adapted variety. You're going to have to maintain it. It's very likely you may even have to spray at some point, as opposed to something that's better suited, like a citrus that has a little bit more disease resistance in our climate, or strawberries, which can be fairly disease resistant depending on which one you get. But even then, there's a lot of difference in between cultivars. In that study I'm doing, that's what I'm looking at. Which one would I recommend to you that has a high disease resistance? And the reason for this is you don't want to have to go out there and spray every week or every 2 weeks. That gets to be tedious, it gets to be expensive, and you're not going to get your money's worth on a small scale production. Insect resistance and control lines up with disease resistance. Ideally, you go with resistant cultivars. There are some ones that get attacked by insects less. The only issue with that is insects are a bit more dynamic. They may say, well, if this is all I have, I'll attack it anyway. But there's other low input things to consider. You can use horticultural neem oils, and traps can be used to help prevent a lot of things as well. Probably the number one thing for fruit, which is where most people are going to see insects attack, pick it as it's ripe and remove the temptation. And there may be some times where if you have a high insect population, you may need to pick it a tad bit before it's ripe to prevent the insects from attacking it. Excuse me. Orchard sanitation is the number one thing you're going to want to consider for both insect and disease resistance. Essentially, if you remove diseased or old, just dead or old tissue, you reduce overwintering or a habitat for pests. So like for strawberries, I go through and remove poor looking leaves about every 2 weeks to remove a reservoir of disease or insects. And this is also lines into harvesting fruit when it's ripe. So you never want rotting fruit out in your orchard because it's just a reservoir for disease. And annual mulching can help because you may miss some things, and if you mulch on top of it, it helps keep it a little bit contained. So what fruit crops, after everything I've talked about, would I recommend for you to grow in your home orchard? Blackberries, blueberries, citrus, and figs are 4 good ones, and then muscadines, pears, persimmons, and strawberries. There are other things that grow well in our area, but may require a little bit more effort to keep going, like apples, bunch grapes, kiwis, peaches, and pecans are going to need a little bit more intense management as far as pruning and disease management, but you can grow them successfully, and there are resistant cultivars. It just is a little bit harder to find sometimes. Now, these bottoms are fruits that are very resistant, do very well, but they're more niche environmentally and may be more popular in certain parts of the state than others, like your loquats, jujurenes, or jujube, depending on how you want to pronounce it, mayhaws, mulberries, olives, and pawpaws. And a lot of these, like pawpaws, are one of those where people either love it or they hate it because of the taste and consistency issues. To me, it tastes a lot like an overripe banana, not my favorite, but it has a nice smooth texture that a lot of people really like. And olives are limited mainly by temperature across the state, but in South Louisiana do really well. Now, home orchard does not have to be large or traditional. So strawberries tend to be the niche that I like to grow, and this is how I grow them, not in the ground, just in a way. The main reason I grow them up is I don't like to bend over. And you can grow things successfully a lot of different ways. And this is part of the strawberry trial I'm doing, where at the moment we're growing about 45 different cultivars and looking at which one will be best.